Uh, Good to see you, Horace. And shake your hand, Bob. Say hello. Anyway, so good to see you, though. We're so very glad that you are here this morning to continue on our exciting study of the book of Ephesians. And so, if you can, go ahead and turn to Ephesians 2 and verse 17. Now, of course, Ephesians 2, verses 11 through 18, is all dealing with the reconciliation we have through Christ. The gospel is one of the synonyms for the gospel is called the ministry of reconciliation, 2 Corinthians 5, 17 through 21. And it's the idea that God reconciled the world to his son. It's the idea that the strong was reconciled with the weak and the godly with the ungodly. It is interesting that at the very beginning of time, with the fall of man, that the promise was made to Eve to tear down enmity between her seed and his seed. And there in Genesis 3:15. And when you look at the idea of that statement, it's called the proto-evangelium, the gospel in seed form, is that the whole thing was dealing, of course, with God talking to the devil. It's been stated that perhaps he didn't want to say it to Eve because they just severed a relationship. And yet he talked to the devil and told the devil that I will reconcile mankind with myself. Now, of course, mankind could not do that by himself in spite of all of the blood and offerings he could ever offer or sacrifice on the altars. It had to come, of course, through Jesus. And so then we look at Ephesians 2, verses 11 through 18, and it's all dealing with this overall theme of reconciliation, the idea of making peace again with God. And of course, the one that did that is God with us. We cannot do it on our own. And so in this section, we also have the other themes of forgiveness and God's grace and God's mercy. All of that is seen in Ephesians chapter 2. And so when you look at Ephesians 2, verse number 16, it says that he might reconcile them both, Jew and Gentile, to God in one body through the cross, thereby putting to death the enmity. And of course, when you look at what Jesus did by putting to death the enmity or the opposition or the conflict, that Jesus Christ rendered sin, death, and the devil himself powerless at the cross. And at the cross, he introduced life, he introduced reconciliation, he introduced forgiveness and happiness and joy. And so he came and he preached peace to you who were far off and to those who are near. Now, of course, verse 17 is dealing with the Jew and the Gentile, those who were near. In Deuteronomy 14, verse number 1, it says that the children of Israel are also called the children of God. And the Gentiles are the ones who are away from God, the ones who are not in God's proximity when it came to covenant, when it came to the temple. Now, the Gentiles had a place in the temple called the court of the Gentiles, where they could come and worship and look around, but they were not allowed access into the Holy of Holies or into any of the inner sanctum. They had to stay on the outside. So here comes Christ. He's going to say, I'm going to tear up all that so that you can now have access in full duties and in full relationship now with God. There's no longer going to be a wall between you and your God and you and your worship. Of course, you see the same thing that Christ says in John 4 with that woman of Samaria at the well. Same discussion. And so, when you look at this idea here of peace, and we know that Jesus Christ is the very Prince of Peace, Isaiah 9, verse number 6, that The idea here of peace shows us the very thing that I think Psalm 72 brings up. And Psalm 72, verses 4 through 17, notice here what is prophesied about when it came to the Messiah. In Psalm 72, verse number 4, it says, "He will bring justice to the poor of the people, and he will save the children of the needy, and he will break in pieces the oppressor. They shall fear you, God, as long as the sun and moon endure throughout all generations." Psalm 72, verse number 6. "He shall come down like rain upon the grass before mowing, like showers that water the earth. In his days the righteous shall flourish, an abundance of peace until the moon is no more. He shall have dominion also from sea to sea and from the river to the ends of the earth. Those who dwell in the wilderness will bow before him, and his enemies will lick the dust. The kings of Tarshish and of the isles will bring presents. The kings of Sheba and Seba will offer gifts. Yes, all kings will fall down before him, and all nations shall serve him. For he will deliver the needy when he cries, the poor also, and him who has no helper. He will spare the poor and needy. He will save the souls of the needy. He will redeem their life from oppression and violence, and precious shall be their blood in his sight. He shall live, and the gold of Sheba will be given to him. Prayer also will be made for him continually, and daily he shall be praised. There will be abundance of grain on the earth. On the top of the mountains his fruit shall wave like Lebanon, and those of the city shall flourish like grass of the earth. His name shall endure forever. His name shall continue as long as the sun, and men shall be blessed in him. All nations shall call him blessed." So Psalm 72, 4 through 17 is all dealing with a messianic picture of what peace looks like in the kingdom of Christ and under the banner of the Prince of Peace. It's, as Isaiah would say later on, that is the time when the lamb will lie down with the wolf. And it's the same idea here. He is going to be consistently going into the Prince of Peace. And the gospel of Christ was always promised to go to those who are near and to those who are far off. That's what you read in Acts 2, 38 through 39. You see the same thing also in, of course, in this verse. And when you pair them up, we understand that the whole idea was to generate peace, enable peace between man and his God. And so now, through the means of peace with God, away from sin and death, we understand that the Lord at his resurrection is the Lord of the angels and the mediator of men. And now he is keeping the mediatorship open as it ought to be. So we have this idea here of peace. Mention those who are near and those who are far off. And how do we have this? Verse 18. "For through him we both have access by one Spirit to the Father." Now, when you look at verse 18, I think it's very important. How do we have access by him or through him by one Spirit to the Father? What does that mean? How do we have access now? By one Spirit. Yeah. Okay. All right. Let's look at a verse. Can somebody read? We're going to read two verses here. First one, or really three verses. First one is 1 Corinthians 12, verse 13. 1 Corinthians 12, verse 13. Can somebody read that for us?
By one Spirit are we all baptized into one body, whether we be Jews or Gentiles, whether we be bond or free, and have been all made to drink into one Spirit.
There you go. Okay, that unifies all of it together, doesn't it? The baptism, access to the Spirit. That's Exodus 38 too. Okay, now we're going to look at another verse, is John 3, verse 36. So we have, of course, 1 Corinthians 12, verse 13 is dealing with the one Spirit. We access that the one Spirit is the one who gives us revelation and instruction and the means by which we can access the Son. And then John 3:36 comes into the Son's role in this thing. Somebody read that for us?
Whoever believes in the Son has eternal life. Whoever does not obey the Son shall not see life.
Okay.
The wrath of God remains on him.
There you go. The wrath of God remains on him. So in that verse in John 3, verse 36, of course, it deals with believe, it goes to life, and obey. Of course, it's all together, believe and obey. But if you don't, what's the result? You have the wrath of God on it. Okay? And then we're going to hook them up together in Romans 8, verse 2. Someone will look at that verse for us. Romans 8, verse number 2.
The law of spirit of life in Christ Jesus that makes you free from the law of sin and death.
Okay? So, here we go. The law of the Spirit in Christ Jesus is what? Life. Okay? So, you hook them up to this verse in Ephesians 2 with 1 Corinthians 12, 13, John 3, 36, Romans 8, verse 2. It's all a picture about how we have access through Him by one Spirit to the Father. Okay? By belief, obedience to His revelation, of course, then that gives us life. You see that all married up there in Romans 8, verse number 2. Of course, I think it's dealing with that we come through the New Testament, which gives us, of course, Christ, and it shows us who Christ is, so it brings us to Jesus. And that, I think, will be the law there. Okay? The law of the Spirit, Romans 8, 2. Now, verse 19 comes in. And what's so good about all this? Verse 19. Now, therefore, you are no longer strangers and foreigners, but fellow citizens with the saints and members of the household of God. When you look at this, no longer strangers and foreigners. I think it's dealing with the idea of a Gentile in the temple, away from, again, the idea of true worship under the Jewish law, now under the Christian law, or what we call the Christian dispensation or time of age. That's no longer there. Now what are we? It says now we're fellow citizens with the saints and members of the household of God. It's interesting to me that the way that the pagans would look at God would be about curses. And the pagan would look at God and they would think about how God is so evil and vile and wicked. And look at all of the catastrophes in the world and what's happening. And yet when you look at Christ, it's saying that we are, of course, His children. Well, we're the Father's children. We're fellow joint heirs with Christ, fellow citizens. As Philippians 3:20 says, we have our citizenship in heaven through Christ. And so this idea of fellow citizens with the saints. Now, I think the little phrase about with the saints and members of the household of God are dealing with the connection between Jew and Gentile. There are other ideas around that suggest perhaps that it's dealing with those who've gone on before. Maybe. Another idea of it is the ones in Acts 2, the Jew who came first into the kingdom, as was supposed to be the case, Romans 1, 15 and 16. That perhaps it's dealing with those who are already inside the church. And we know that the Lord asked to his church, Acts 2, verse 47. It could be that as well. I think it's dealing again just with the general overall context of Jew and Gentile together. But there are other ideas around this idea about with the saints, because aren't you a saint yourself? Why do you gotta go be with the saints? Go ahead. Yes, it is. That's a great point. Great point. And that's Galatians 3. It says that he's pulling out the distinction. And that's coming to access to salvation, I know. But yeah, it's a good point. Is it Morris? No. Okay. Yeah.
Two different cultures, the Jews and the non-Jews. You know, the Jews and the non-Jews.
Yeah.
Which that was what you would call the hostility involved because of the different way they looked at certain things from their culture. You know.
Sure.
And that they say he abolished that.
Mm-hmm.
He literally got rid of that through Jesus and the cross.
Yeah.
But still, even today, way to now, we still struggle with enmity and hostility from that. Even as Christians today, which way some of the world is still.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So this is very important study because we got a lifelong challenge that we are dealt with because of that curse.
Yeah.
Started right there at the beginning.
Yeah. 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 It's a great point. And it's interesting that when you look at how the world is to perceive the Christian, Christ says there in John 13, verse 34 and 35, how's the world to know that we're Christians? By what? There we go. That's what it says. It's interesting because, normally anytime that there's a kingdom coming in, it's through violence, or it's through kind of like with the Venezuela thing, a change of leadership overnight type thing. Very common. That was very common practice to take out a head of state in their time. It was not anything that was beyond imagination. It happened all the time. I think even one time in various countries, most time, there'll be maybe a day or two rain, then that person's out all the way again. I mean, there's some crazy stuff. No violence will happen. But yet right here, with the coming of the kingdom, and with the church in full force, as it is of course, in the writing of this epistle and now today, that our whole banner is not under violence, but under the idea of loving God, loving one another. That's Matthew 22, verse 37 to 39. And the great commandment is to love your Lord your God with all your heart, mind, and strength. Second is to do what? Love your neighbor as yourself. Yeah. So, right here, I think it's dealing with the idea of God's love for the stranger, God's love for the foreigner, which goes right into what you're saying. What you got?
If we view the world today, the secular world
Yeah.
And that can't be.
Yeah.
But secular Christians have so much identified themselves with Judaism
Yeah.
that the worldview is there's no difference.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's the phrase about Judeo-Christian, which I don't think you can be. I think you're either one or the other. I don't know how anyone can be a Judeo-Christian, but that's the idea that's a secular term to hitch up the Jewish idea to the Christian. And in fact, when you look at the Jew back in this time, from the Jewish perspective and Roman perspective, the Christian was seen as an atheist. And we were seen as the usurpers because we didn't align with the Jewish religion. And so we were seen as atheists from them. And then from the Roman perspective, when things were happening in that empire, we were seen as atheists. We didn't align with their gods and Caesar worship and stuff. And so both groups equally hated the Christians for different reasons. I think one was more political, one was more religious. But both of them were very emphatic that there's no connection there.
I think the world is confused on the difference between political alliances and religious alliances.
Sure.
As Christians, we have no religious alliance with Israel. Israel doesn't exist.
Yeah.
And politically, yes. Why? We were classed together because we have the same, basically, I won't say exactly, but basically the same conservative political outlook.
Sure.
And so they're mixing politics with religion.
Sure. Which, of course, Israel, the new Israel is the church. And that's Galatians 6:16. Yes, it is. Yeah, Revelation 21:10. Yeah, it's another good one. So, what Paul's doing here is he's saying all that stuff is gone. Now you have equal access to the Father through Christ. Let me look at my thing here. Okay, let's look at that. When you look at the household of God, that also goes into the same idea that we are not following after a servant, but a son. Okay, let's look at Hebrews 3, verses 5 and 6. Can somebody read that for us? Hebrews 3, verses 5 and 6. And as you're going there, I want to say a few more quick things as you're turning to Hebrews 3, 5, and 6. That Moses, the highest recommendation that Jesus gives to Moses is that Moses wrote about Jesus. So, Hebrews, for that reference, that's John 5, verse 46. The 6? I think it is 6. Where it says he wrote about me. Okay? Moses was never intending to become the ultimate lawgiver. That was reserved only for the son. Moses was only be a servant. Okay? Now, let's look at Hebrews 3, verses 5 and 6. Can somebody read that for us?
And Moses indeed was faithful in all his house as a servant for a testimony whose house we are, if we hold fast the confidence and the rejoicing of the hope firm to the end.
Okay? So, Moses was a servant, but were of the household of God, which therefore are of the Son's household. So, very important. And if you go back to the last chapter in Hebrews 2, verse number 11, notice what he says over there. Let me turn over there myself. It says, for both he who sanctifies and those who are being sanctified are all of one, for which reason he is not ashamed to call them brethren. So, excuse me. The very ideas being brought out here, of course, is that we are the sheep of his pasture. We are of the Son, and there's no distinction. And really, the book of Hebrews is all about trying to tear up that distinction, too, between Moses and Jesus. And that's really its whole theme for the book. It's really trying to say Christ is greater. Moses was a servant, Christ is the Son. And so he's really trying to hammer that in from the old law. He's trying to say the old law told you about this happening. Here it is on full display. Take it or leave it. So, when you look at, of course, all of this, I think it's very important, though, that we understand that we are of, and that's why we say we're the church of Christ, because Christ is of whose household we are. We're of the Son's household. Therefore, we're of his church. Matthew 16, verse 16 through 18. It's all connected. Okay? A sister section of this is 1 Peter 2, verses 6 through 11, which says very similar things, but it goes into the other ideas of mercy a little bit more. But I want us to look at a few verses there really quick. 1 Peter 2, verses 6 through 11. And this lines up with Ephesians 2, verse number 19. But really quick, 1 Peter 2, verses 6 through 11. Let me get there. I'm in chapter 3 here. There we are. Verse 9 says, but you are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, his own special people. Or some versions there put ones of his own possession, that you may proclaim the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light, who once were not a people, but are now people of God, who had not obtained mercy, but now have obtained mercy. Beloved, I beg you, as sojourners and pilgrims, abstain from fleshly lusts, which war against the soul. Now, when you look at verse 9 is Peter taking Deuteronomy 7:6, applied that verse to the Gentile, to the Jew. He said that verse applies in the wider context to the church, to the Jew and Gentile together, to the church. And then, of course, we're introduced to the radiance of his glory here, the brightness of Jesus, Hebrews 1:1 through 2, to his marvelous light. That's why Isaiah calls him the Son of Righteousness, S-U-N. Christ is the Son of Righteousness, his marvelous light. And he shone through the darkness of despair, death, and sin, and brought man out very triumphantly. We know that he brought immortality to life from a tomb, a place of death and despair. And he said, through the power of God, just as Christ came out of the tomb, so you and I come out of the darkness of life and sin and death. And therefore we have obtained mercy because of the great radiance of his glory. Now, when you look at what's all happening here, of course, back in Ephesians 2, verse 19, it's all dealing with tearing down that middle wall. Okay, we're no longer strangers and pilgrims but now we're fellow citizens and heirs. Okay? You are an heir to the very palaces of God. That's where your home lies. John 14, 1 through 3. You have an inheritance that's now incorruptible, that does not fade away, reserved in heaven for you. 1 Peter 1, verses 4 and 5. And so now we have full access to heaven. That's what he's trying to say here. But look back again at Ephesians 2, verse number 20. And in this verse, which is up to 1 Peter 2, verses 6 through 9, says, and having been built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets, Jesus Christ himself being the chief cornerstone, in whom the whole building being fitted together grows into a holy temple in the Lord, in whom also you also are being built together for a dwelling place of God in the Spirit. Verse 20, of course, gives us the foundation of the apostles and the prophets, Christ himself being the chief cornerstone. When you look at the ideas here of the apostles and the prophets, of course, the prophets, I think it's dealing with the Old Testament prophets, how Christ is going to be the fulfillment of all of their prophetic visions and revelation, but also the apostles. When you look at John 17, verse number 18, there is to be no distinction between the apostles and Jesus when it came to what they each say. Everyone, the Spirit, the Father, and the apostles all taught the same thing. Okay? Everything originated from the Father. The Spirit in John 16, verse 13 says that he speaks what he heard from the Father. John 16, verse 13. Christ speaks what he heard. John 5, verse 30. Says, I know nothing but what I hear. You see also John 14, verse 10 and verse 24. And so when it comes to the foundation of the apostles and prophets, we see in that little phrase the words of eternity ringing forth from past age to present age. We understand that in John 17, verse number 18, Christ says, as I was sent from the Father, so I send them out as well. In John 17, verse number 18. And so nobody can go to heaven around the apostles' teaching, which is the same as Christ's teaching, which is the same as the Father's teaching. And so that's why we read verses like Acts 2, where it says that the first church in Jerusalem there was around the apostles' doctrine. Why is that so important? Because it's the same one as what Christ taught. And so there's a foundation piece here. And of course, it all hinges on Jesus Christ himself being the chief cornerstone. Now, it's interesting that when you look at Ephesians so far, when you look at the phrase, of course, Jesus Christ, we know that Christ is not his last name. Okay? Jesus means what? What does the name Jesus mean? Savior. All right. Salvation. Matthew 1, verse 23. And he shall be called Jesus, for he shall save his people from their sins. Okay? And Christ means what? The anointed one. What you said? Savior, okay, the Messiah. Okay, yeah. So he's emphasizing, because what Paul does is Paul will transpose Christ Jesus, like you see in 3:1 of Ephesians, with Jesus Christ. Now, I think he's doing that to create a point. That right here, he's emphasizing the salvation from Messiah as the chief cornerstone, whereas in Ephesians 3:1, he's going to deal with the Messiah as the one that saves. And so I think he's trying to use even the name Jesus Christ to get a hold of a message and an imagery there. Okay? And so here he is, the one that saves is the one that leads you, he himself being the chief cornerstone. And that's what I think he's trying to get a hold of. Okay? And of course, you look at other verses, which you've already mentioned about John 10, about we are the sheep of his pasture. We are of his household, Hebrews 3, verse number 6. All this is painting a picture. Okay? Him being the chief cornerstone, of course, is dealing with masonry. That any time that a door was put in masonry, they had to have a chief cornerstone to make that door all fit together. That was to fill in all the gaps, just to keep everything, make it nice and flush. You had to have that piece. What you got?
You said that because I pulled up on Google.
Oh.
What cornerstone is, and it says the purpose is to serve as a foundational reference point for a building, which we are.
Yeah.
Establishing it as an orientation and stability, which also acts as a symbolic marker for construction and ownership.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah. And even inside masonry, that's where a lot of the builders will put their initials at too, or their seal or symbols, that kind of thing. Yeah. Yeah. And that's 1 Timothy 2 all over too, about we are sealed by the Lord there. So that will also go to the cornerstone. Yeah, so he's going to stabilize both groups. If you look at from the door standpoint, you look at from, we'll say, right side, this is right side for y'all, would be, I guess left side would be better. Left side would be Old Testament, chief cornerstone, New Testament, all hinges on the chief cornerstone of Christ. Right? So, there we go. And that's why it says, in whom the whole building being fitted together, all of it connects at the top, very pinnacle at Christ, and grows into a holy temple in the Lord. That's an interesting little phrase there, because temples are not growing anywhere. You wouldn't go past, think about temple in our city, about, the temple down the road here in Avenue E. That thing's enormous. But you wouldn't go past the temple and say, that thing grew out an extra wing overnight. Now someone built it. But the idea of the temple there is not dealing with anything literal or physical. It's dealing with the spiritual. Of course, you look at 1 Peter 2 for that. It says that we are living stones. Right? We are a living sacrifice. Romans 12, 1 and 2. All those things are lining up right here. And of course, the church is the temple today. And so that's 1 Corinthians 6, verses 18 through 20. And so he's saying all this grows into the temple of God in the Lord. And whom also you being built together. So now what's our role in this? Being built together for a dwelling place of God in the Spirit. Now again, I think this goes back to verse 16 and 18, that through the Spirit's means, which is through revelation and through his promise and through the dwelling of the Spirit, Acts 2:38, that the Spirit is only reserved for the Christian. Nobody else has access to the Spirit. And that was all to be the case from the very beginning of time. And that's one thing, that I heard about a while ago about why the Chinese, because, in China, there's a very big movement of Christian underground. And one of the things I've heard about, the reason for that is because, according to paganists and Chinese, if you don't know Chinese, most Chinese are going to be atheists. Okay, they are atheists, and I mean that in the strict term, not in the idea of they're pagan. I mean they're atheists. Okay, but in China there's a growing movement of Christianity because of this very fact that they say that only in Christianity does your God come and live with you. Now, there is always meant to be a total connection and cohesion there between you and God. And that's why you read verses like 1 Peter 1, where it says that we are of the divine nature. How is anybody born flesh and blood a partaker of the divine nature? It has to come through Christ. And you read that in 1 Peter, I think 2 Peter 1, 3 and 4. Verse 4 is where that one is. But, and so I think right here he's dealing with our habitation of God in the Spirit. That Christ reigns in his church. And then you look at Ephesians 4, where it says that we ought to endeavor to keep the union of the Spirit in the bond of peace. So the union of the Spirit and the bond of peace, that's the idea that we do all things because the same thing as, the Father and the Son are one. John 10, verse 30. The Spirit is one with them. There's no separation between the Godhood of the Father, the Son, and the Spirit. They're all connected cohesively. That's why we say that they're of one nature. Okay? And so right here, by being connected with the Spirit, Ephesians 2, verse 22, we have connection with God and Christ. It's all connected. Okay? So, that is all I have for class. We're right on time. Really quick, are there any other quick comments? Was everyone happy and good? Great. Well, next week, we will start in Ephesians 3, verse number 1. And so I hope you can be back for that. And bring a friend. You have a big group again. So we'll have church here in a few minutes. Thank you very much.